all black everything, all black, you know, all black in the name of all my black heroes, all black everything, all black polos, all black medallions, yeah, all black, yo.
It's an honor to have the two of you here. You've collaborated together in the past. We also now know that Farah at some point got her hair did in Nina's mama's shop in Cambridge. So a literal, right, hands-on connection that we discovered today. A lot of this book, Farah, is about community, right? And community putting hands on folks in need. It's also the story of you and your father, who was a girl dad, and how he almost intuitively knew to create a safe space for you in the event that he would be absent.
I really think that the grief journey, for some reason, I had my public life and my private life in two different compartments, and I was happy with that, and I kept them. What you have done is to take this private pain and weave it through this writing, thereby giving yourself probably a new perspective. I know that's been the case for me. It's a windy height that you find yourself on this grief journey. You look down and it's like so big and so huge. But who told us we couldn't be creative in our grief? It's a lie I told myself, that creativity is here and grief is here. Right. But when they are joined, oh my, the doorways you can go through. And you don't get released from crying.
No.
Too bad there's no getaway free pass on that.
No,
There's
not
no
at all.
getaway free pass on the heartache, the real thing, like it really hurts, like you broke your leg, really hurts.
Yes.
You go through all of that, but you also have this other doorway that expands you, and rather than closure, you end up widespread.
Yes.
You end up with Swiss cheese holes in you.
That's so true.
Where all kinds of things rush through and become real in the world that would not have been able to be real if you hadn't sat with the big G.
Yep.
And she sometimes needs talking to, the big G.
Yeah.
Because sometimes she can be rough, and that's when you need to tell her, look, you sit over there.
Right.
Hush your mouth and give me a moment because you're on me with your fingers in my hair all the time. I mean, sometimes you have to just like say, I need to breathe.
Yes.
And having this dialogue through your art, whatever your art is a way of moving through it.
Yeah, and a way of moving through the world, right? You are so right. And I mean, I think that, you know, just like I was saying to Nina that I listened to her music and I heard songs that I thought I knew. I thought I knew these songs, right? And all of a sudden I'm like, oh, wait, I never heard that in that song, right? That she brought something to those songs, a depth and a meaning that as much as I knew them and loved them, I had never experienced them in that way. And now I only want to hear them that way, right? And I think that there's a metaphor I use in the book My mother was a seamstress, and so there's a chapter devoted to my mother as seamstress. And when I was about maybe 12, I discovered the fabric eyelet. And I fell in love with it, and I wanted her to make me eyelet dresses all the time. And then eyelet becomes a kind of metaphor. It's the Swiss cheese. Because if you know eyelet, it's a form of lace, but it's not a delicate lace. It's a sturdy lace, right? And it's made with literally those, the tool is an eyelet that makes holes. So it's delicate because it has the holes, but then the holes are reinforced with these embroidered threads that make it strong. And that's the way grief felt to me. It felt like the hole was not going to heal. Like, oh, you'll heal. No. Like the hole does nothing. The hole is there. And you continue to grow around it, and you learn to incorporate it. And it becomes part of the story you tell, and it becomes part of the beauty, right? So that, and like you said, all kinds of things come through the hole. Some wind comes through, but some light comes through, some possibility comes through. And I do think also you do sometimes have to talk to the grief and say, okay, you know what? Like, you're not taking over. Like my mother, there's a line that I say, my mother's sisters, my mother's a baby girl of 3. And I remember when, and my mother went into traditional mourning, like she wore black, like 19th century widows, she wore black. And I remember her sisters saying to her, okay, baby, it's time for you to come out of that black. Like you've done it, you've given it this time, and yes, you love your husband and you're going to miss him, but it's time for you to come out of that black. And that to me was talking to the grief, like, okay, there's a place for you, but it's not going to be the whole place for you. So, yeah.
You write a little bit about your father and If You Can't Be Free.
Yes.
When you begin to tell the story about his death. But he's with you in every chapter of this book. I mean, literally in the text.
Yes.
Clearly you've carried him with you, even to the extent of naming the book.
Yeah.
Tell a little bit of that story about how the book gets its title.
So initially, the book went through 3 titles. The first one was a title that I was using when I was giving talks about the book, right? And so that was In Pursuit of Justice and Grace, because that's also a theme in the book. So I thought that was going to be the title, and then my editor didn't really think it worked, and she said maybe a chapter, but not for the book. Then a line from a Toni Morrison essay about Black women, the line is "A Knowing So Deep," and that was going to be my title. And my dear friend, my dear late friend, who just recently passed, the lovely Valerie Boyd, a mutual friend said, that's going to be the title of Valerie Boyd's next book. And so I called Valerie, and I've known Valerie since we were juniors in college. And she was in love with Alice Walker, and I was in love with Toni Morrison, and so we go a long way. So I called her and I said, are you using this, A Knowing So Deep? And she said, oh yeah, that's the title I'm going to use. So I gave it up, and then I kept thinking I knew it would come to me, and I quoted in the book a note that my father wrote me in pencil in front of a paperback book that he wanted me to read. And there are 3 notes, and each of them has this phrase, and some iteration of this phrase, read until you understand. Baby, read this until you understand. You might not understand it at first, but read it until you understand. If you don't understand it at first, ask your teacher, and she will help you, but read it until you understand. And I thought, that's why those other titles didn't work, because this is supposed to be the title of the book. And so that's how that title came to be. And you're right, he's in every chapter. He's only in the introduction of If You Can't Be Free, but that wasn't enough. He wanted more time. So, yeah.
There's a quote that you have in the book in describing justice movements, and you talk about a patient sense of justice. And it feels like that's a metaphor really for Black literature. Yeah. In this moment of social media and breaking news and our need to be fulfilled with some sort of justice in the moment, Black literature does a different kind of labor.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that it's a slow You know, it recognizes the need for a slow and persistent fight. And I think there's a kind of maturity about it. And I think this is true even of, you know, all of our political traditions as well. We know that we are often, when we're young, we think we're fighting and we're gonna change it tomorrow. But the longer you're in it, you know that you're actually fighting for a generation beyond you, that you might not even see it, but you're gonna like fight for it so that the next generation can see it. And that's the sense that I get from the literary, especially when the books are talking to each other. They're talking to each other through time. You know, that this is a marathon, and here's your baton, and this is your moment to like fight this fight. But it's a much slower, patient and persistent pace, I think.
Yeah. There's and this is probably a bad reference, but it's one that everybody will get. There's a Forrest Gump quality to your life as you represent it in the book.
Did you hear what he said? He called me Forrest Gump.
I said Forrest Gump.
No.
I know, because you know, like, you were working for Judge Higginbotham in high school.
Yeah, right.
I mean, let's just start with that. And,
yes.
And then you tell the story of just getting at Penn and you're just walking across the campus and wow, there goes Tony K. Bambara.
No, it is. It is.
What has it been like for you as this well-known literary scholar, right, and musical scholar also, who was introduced to the word as a source of knowledge as a child, to have so many people as you've gone through your career, right? And this is applicable to you also, Nina, because I remember the conversation we had about why you recorded Heritage and the conversation you had with Joe Williams about it, right? So you both have experienced this. What has it been like to have these folks that you look up to be able to have conversations with Toni Morrison? Yeah. Right, to be able to sit down with a Tony K. Bambara, right, who doesn't know who you are yet, right? Yeah. What was it like in those experiences?
Oh, I've always counted them as blessings. Like, I've always counted them as blessings. Like, I felt each one of those encounters as a blessing and as a gift that I was supposed to do something with, you know? And you know, talk about grief. I remember when we first lost Tony, and I was overwhelmed with grief. And yet, at every turn, I was overwhelmed with gratitude. Because I thought, like, just the fact that I can feel this grief for this person, I am so grateful that she was in my life. And so I think that in all those instances, I've always been aware of gratitude, that I just happened to, you know, it is like Forrest Gump. I just happened to be on this journey, and look, I'm playing hooky from school, and there's Patti LaBelle. Right. You know.
First class at Harvard, and there's Werner Solis.
Right, exactly. It just, you know, and so, and never expecting those experiences, never looking for them, but always fully aware and grateful for when they happen. Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned Toni Cade. I didn't know she taught at Duke.
Oh, I didn't know that either.
Until you mentioned it in the book, and I did a little archival search, and like literally, it's like the collection of letters between administrators at Duke to her, you know, teaching a semester what she was going to teach that semester, which was pretty. I want to say David Walker's Appeal.
Oh wow, I believe it. She would, because she was teaching all that stuff, and that conversation I had with her. You know, that story is even deeper than comes out in the book. I had just moved back to Philadelphia. Borders bookstore, remember Borders? Borders was on Walnut Street. I was in Borders, and there was a magazine with a black man on the cover. I don't know, he had been involved in some kind of scandal. And there was an elderly black woman there telling me, oh, they only put us on the cover when we're involved in scandals. And it turns out, this is the same day, her son was one of the black people who had testified at the Clarence Thomas hearings. And she was telling me about her son, who at that time we all knew, having just testified. So I walked out of Barnes & Noble with that on my mind, and there was Toni Cade Bambara sitting there, you know, because she lived in Philly. And I think that she was this kind of person who, wherever she found herself, she was teaching. Mm-hmm. And I'm not surprised that she was teaching David Walker's Appeal, because she asked me what I was going to be teaching, and I told her, you know, and I said something about slave narratives. And she said, oh, they aren't slave narratives. She said, I don't know why they call them slave narratives. Those are freedom narratives, you know. And it just was like that shift in perspective that she could do, you know. And I thought, yeah, they're all about freedom. That's what they're about.
Talk a little bit about Walker for folks who don't know about David Walker's Appeal and the fact that it was outlawed specifically here in North Carolina.
Yeah. So I knew nothing about David Walker's Appeal until I went to college and was taught it, and things that I had associated, language that I had associated with the militancy of Malcolm X was in David Walker's Appeal. So David Walker writes what he calls an appeal to the colored citizens of the world. And it is this scathing critique of white supremacy, this admonition for Black people to overthrow slavery and self-defense, a call for self-defense, a kind of call for Black self-love. And it was banned. It was banned throughout the South, and yet it was carried through, it was even before, you know, we know the Pullman Porters carried like the Chicago Defender to the South, but in 1833, Black sailors were carrying this subversive material, and sometimes it would be sewn in the linings of their coats, right? And it had a life. It's not like suddenly people didn't know about it, because many years later, Henry Highland Garnett, then his own militant statement, right, quotes it and publishes his statement alongside, republishes it alongside David Walker's Appeal. So it had a life in Black reading communities before it ever got into our classrooms. And I think that's sort of a theme of the book, that so many of the things that I was introduced to before they were being taught in our classes, I was introduced to by a kind of, a sort of on the ground Black intellectual tradition that was not in the formal academy.
For a moment, let's talk, and to bring you into this also, Nina, because so much of what we've come to value, we've had to access in non-formal contexts. Mm-hmm. You know, we weren't necessarily going to hear certain genres of jazz music on the radio, for instance, right? This is the reason why more people have listened to Kenny G than have ever listened to John Coltrane, right? And that's not so much a comment on Kenny G as it is a comment on these larger structures. Mm-hmm. And we're in this unique moment now, right? Not unique, right? Because it's a return to the past, right? Where folks are banning books, trying to choose what books are going to be in free public libraries. Mm-hmm. What does it mean for us to create and maintain, again, informal avenues for us to be able to access our culture?
We have always had to do that.
That's right. There you go.
Those early things that we were taught or not taught, those things we grabbed from life, from our communities, from our churches, from the barbershop, you know, wisdom, information about how to live, sitting at the feet of the grandmothers who would tell us how to take care of yourself if you end up being by yourself. Yes. This kind of thing, formal and informal, is the stuff that we make our lives with. And I think that this uprising, this upswelling, this looking in the mirror of who we are, which this book is. This book is a mirror. Yes. This book is an opportunity to weave some stories which sit in impolite conversation with each other. Right. I love that creative friction. You know, that's barbershop. That's folk sitting
Right.
in there, and I've got this perspective, or what, did you ever think about it this way?
Right.
All of that kind of stuff is, we are nothing if we are not storytellers.
Yeah.
And our stories are the life, this is what is left when we leave our physical bodies.
Right.
These stories are endure. So we're still talking about David Walker's Appeal
Right.
because it was writ down, and it's being found as value in these moments. And we need to be more curious.
Yeah.
We need to be more curious about what's out there and not accept what's being fed to us
Not at all.
as the only story. We live and die on story. And the more threads that are woven, the more beautiful the fabric.
Much more beautiful. No, absolutely. I mean, I think that, I think about this book banning and what it means for this nation that we're here, but I also think about if we were counting on kind of certain formal educational institutions to give us access to those books, or to give us, I'm looking at Rick, to give us access to Black art, right? Or music, a kind of canon of our music. If we counted up, we wouldn't have them, right? We wouldn't have them. That we always had ways of teaching and of knowing and of passing down and of creating our own canons. And I was just reading a chapter, and you write about this. I mean, you write about the archive, like our own archives, right, that we created. I was just reading a chapter in my colleague Bob O'Mealy's book about the movie Paris Blues. Some of you might know that movie, but Paul Newman and Sidney Poitier. And that initially, when it was being created as a movie, the movie maker was inspired by his friend Romare Bearden, and wanted a story about a Black artist in Paris. But Hollywood said,
Nope.
no. They were like, there's no such thing. What are you talking about? Like, make him into a jazz musician maybe, and then make him into a white jazz musician. So I say all that to say that this is not the first time, that we have passed down our books and our stories and our music and created our own tradition and sense of canon making and all of that. And I think we just have to learn, not that we don't fight the forces that want to ban books. I mean, we have to fight them because it's leading us into like totalitarianism. We have to fight them, but we also have to recover that sense that we aren't dependent on those spaces to provide us with our own history.
The irony of Paris Blues, I just watched all 6 episodes of that Newman and Joanne Woodworth documentary,
right.
and it talks about the film, and he's the star, right?
Yes.
It's a Paul Newman film, and how he felt that he was secondary to Poitier and Woodworth because they were better actors than he was, and he knew it.
Yes, right.
And
Much
he knew it,
better
and he carried that actually through his whole career and marriage to Woodworth.
Wow.
Knowing that he wasn't the better actor.
Yeah,
Right?
no, the story of that film and what they did, Duke Ellington wrote the score. Paul Newman is a trombonist, but neither Newman nor Sidney Poitier played their instruments. The instruments were dubbed, and the director insisted that a white trombonist play the dubbed. It's so utterly ridiculous. But there's we could do a whole show on Hollywood, right?
Can't talk with you, especially with the both of you here, without talking about music. And I put together a little playlist of stuff in the book.
Oh, wow.
Earth, Wind and Fire, All About Love.
Yes.
Gene Ammons, which was your parents' song, the song that was played at your father's funeral. What has been your relationship to literature and music?
Yeah.
Right, in what ways has the literature helped you to think differently about music and vice versa?
Wow. So I think for me, the literature initially was the solitary pursuit. It was what I did on my own, by myself, or with my father, but after he died, mostly by myself. It was a solitary pleasure. And the music was the communal, and it became a solitary pleasure, but it was communal. And one of the things that I say in the book was, more than books, you know, in my upbringing, it was music. The music was ubiquitous. It was everywhere.
You didn't have to turn it on. It was always on.
Like it wasn't, I don't remember it not being on. It was intergenerational. You know, everybody listened to Motown. One aunt liked the blues, the other one liked Monk, you know, and you thought you knew something about somebody based on the music that they liked. But a family gathering, it wasn't just one song, one generation of music. The music, it was ours. It was everywhere. So I think that I wasn't even aware of how, you know, how much it was shaping and informing me just because I took it for granted. Whereas with the books, I think I felt I knew. With Black literature, it is imbued with the music. Black writers are always engaging the music. They write about it. They are inspired by it. So it's almost impossible for me to teach a Black literature course. I teach Black literature courses and play music throughout the whole thing. That's why the Norton Anthology of African American Literature has a seat. Well, I don't know, now it's probably a playlist. But was the only one that had an accompanying CD. And that has a vernacular section that's music, right? And song, in addition to oral tales and things like that, because you can't separate them. Yeah.
You have something to add, Nina?
I just think that at some point, song was all we had.
Yeah.
Our bodies were in service of the oppressors.
Right.
We poured a lot of energy through song.
Yep.
So the stories are there. If you want to know about a people, you can look at their sorrow song and understand some things. Maybe if you're outside of the culture, you understand a surface. But if you ask somebody,
Yes.
you will get another perspective that I got shoes, you got shoes, all God's children got shoes. That was a statement that wasn't true. Because all God's children didn't have shoes.
Right.
When we get to heaven, gonna put on our shoes. The heaven up there? No, the heaven out there, beyond the reach of your lash. Everybody talking about heaven ain't going there.
That's right.
Talk about a side eye.
That's a total side eye. Right, signifying.
I'm just saying. If you don't know, you better ask somebody. So within our most humble expressions are the stories of a people who always resisted the institutions that sought to dehumanize them. If there is a lesson we can take from those many griefs, is to keep doing it. M-Archive.
Yes.
Keep doing it. Keep telling past, present, and future stories, Miss Filmmaker. Keep doing that.
That's right.
This is our lifeblood. And they didn't really sort of count on us being here in 2022 anyway, so we might as well act a pure fool.
That's right. Absolutely, you have nothing to lose. That's the thing that's so clear when you listen to the music and you read the literature and you listen to the voices, you hear the voices, is that they were like, it can't get no worse. Like, we have nothing to lose. And I think one of my favorite things are the descriptions of people who would try to transcribe the music, and they couldn't. So here you have a people whose bodies are captured, but you can't capture their music on a Western scale, right? You can't capture, you know, the notes that they're singing. You cannot capture it. So Nina is so right.
Those institutions were not about nuance.
No.
They were bludgeony things.
Exactly.
They were big, you know,
right,
blocky things.
Yep.
There was no
subtlety.
We went in the crevices and in the cracks and in between.
Yep.
We talk about Billie Holiday.
Yeah.
Right. You tell that story, Farah, in the book about, you know, they're like, you're singing out of tune, Billie. She's like, I'm not.
Right.
It's like, y'all just can't hear.
You can't hear it.
You can't hear what I'm
exactly.
singing.
Right. Same thing with Abby Lincoln, you know. She's like, no, she's absolutely right. You are wrong. You can't hear it. There's something wrong with your ears.
You tell the story about your the family luncheonette.
Oh, yeah.
and the jukebox.
Yes.
So talk to young people now and try to find some sort of contemporary example
it's so
of a
hard.
jukebox.
Yes.
Right, and you know, Spotify doesn't quite work because you ain't got to pay for that, right? Someone
Exactly.
had to decide to put the money into,
Right.
and got to control the playlist.
Yes,
Right,
yes.
by the money they put in,
That's
right? You
right.
want to hear something different, you got to put some money
You
in
gotta
there.
put some money
right?
in there, yes.
But the way even like with Motown, like Motown would do the stuff that it wanted to go top 40, right? But you know, the black acts,
Yes.
black acts, right? Junior Walker and the All-Stars, Gladys Knight, Shorty
Right.
Long. That's the stuff they would put in jukeboxes in black
jukeboxes.
communities.
That's right.
Right, because you
Yeah.
weren't going to hear that on the top Pop 40 radio station.
No.
Talk about that culture of people coming together to listen to
Yeah.
music.
We had it was a little luncheonette, and it had been a luncheonette. I mean, it was set up to be a luncheon, like, you know, it had stuff in it, but it had been closed down when we somehow got it. And one of the things that was already in it was a jukebox. And so it had like all of these old songs on there. And then as we were there, we would add songs. And there was these little 45, I can still see it. I mean, it's like this square thing, it's red on the bottom, it's glass on the top. And there are these 45 records, you put a dime in. If you want one song, you put a quarter and you
Whatever
get
you
five
want.
or whatever.
Right,
You know? And you see the little 45 come up and it goes down and then it plays the music. And so there were these old songs that were from before I was born that people would come in during the day, mostly older men would come in and play those.
So Billy Eckstine.
Yes, right. And then there would be, you know, there would be newer songs that my cousins would put in. And it was always exciting when there was a new song to be in there. And then they would spark conversations about Stevie Wonder's accident. Was he going to make it? And the music that he made after his
Afterwards,
accident.
right.
And songs about what's going on. But also, as a girl later on, I would hear what I knew was a remake, my friends would think was a new song, but because of the jukebox, I knew that that was a remake. Who's Loving You? You know, like, that's an old song. Because, you know, that history, the jukebox contained that history. Sometimes people would come in and dance in this little teeny spot that we had. They would dance, but mostly it was a conversation starter about our musicians, Curtis Mayfield. And growing up in Philadelphia, later on, the sound of Philadelphia was big.
I mean, you're in Philadelphia in the
Yeah,
70s. I mean,
right.
that
So it's
was a
just-
moment.
It's a moment. But yeah, the jukebox is just it's an artifact that is hard to describe to people who haven't experienced it. But that when I think of the restaurant, I think of the jukebox. Yeah.
When you talk about your father, you mentioned that the time that you had your father was a time also of movement culture.
Yes.
How aware were you as a girl
Yeah.
of the movement that was happening?
Yeah, I was very aware because, you know, my father, I think he felt like he was born a generation too late, like he wanted to be a Black Panther, you know, but he was a little older. And Philadelphia was, whenever there's a social movement, Philadelphia is a seat of it, from the 19th century on, from the abolitionist movement all the way through. And so, you know, there were these kind of movement bookstores that I would go to with my father, and you'd get news about where the protests were going to be, and the Black Panther paper was for sale, or he would take me to rallies. I remember going to a rally where we were waiting to hear Huey Newton. So I was, you know, it was, I think I was fully aware of it, but it was normalized. So when it was no longer that excitement, I was more aware of the loss of it, because from the time I could remember through the time my father died, it was a very active, it was kind of like a Black Lives Matter moment, you know, in Philly, yeah.
Do you feel some of that energy? I mean, you began this book 2016, right? The end of the world for so many of us, the end of time.
Yeah.
So you're writing through that political moment, right? And then the pandemic happens, right? And then we get this intensity
Oh yeah.
of anti-Black violence that then we write, you know, Black Lives Matter functions against. And now we're seeing, you know, a response to that.
Yes.
Why choose literature in that moment?
Yeah. So
I mean, because so many of our colleagues are writing about Black Lives Matter and
Yeah.
political theory and all important work.
Right.
You chose to do a deep dive
Into the
in the
literary.
value of literature in this moment.
You know, this book grows out of my life, but it also grows out of my teaching. And I started thinking about it during the 2016 election. Initially, when I started thinking about it, literally, I was like, you know, when I think about what I hear us talking about now, like the threat to democracy, like people act like they're surprised that thing
happened.
led to a threat to
Right.
democracy. Like it was clear that it was leading to a threat to democracy in the campaign. And I was like, if he wins, you know, like and his name is not mentioned in my book, but it was, I think there was this, I had this feeling and I thought, Black people in America have always been more committed to democracy than their fellow citizens. I mean, it has not been an abstraction, right? It's not an abstraction, it's not theoretical, and it was there in the literature, right? It was there in the literature that I was teaching. So initially, that's what I thought I was writing. I thought I was writing a book to show how we contributed to the expansion of democracy, how to the extent that the nation lived up to any kind of principles of democracy. Our writers documented that Black people did that along with others. That's what I thought I was writing about. And then it became clear that I was writing about more than that, that I was writing about a set of values, both kind of almost spiritual values for survival, and that the question of democracy was part of it, but it was not the only thing. And that the values that I was writing about transcended nation, actually. And so it transformed, but always they were lessons learned primarily through literature and through the lives of working class Black people. As I was finishing it, what helped me finish it, the pandemic helped me finish it because I had to stop. You know, all my travel stopped. I continued to travel to Philadelphia because I have an elderly mother who lives in Philadelphia, so I continued to visit her. But everything else stopped, so I had a little time. And then George Floyd happened. And when George Floyd happened and the response to it, it really, it shook me. It absolutely shook me because the two chapters that I had not yet written that I had in my head were the chapter on resistance and the chapter on death, on Black death. And there I was being confronted with it again.
Right.
You know, and the stuff that I was reading, I could read it out loud and it would be as if it had been written that day. You know, and that helped me think that I was doing the right thing, that those writers were speaking to us through generations about death, about resistance. And the resistance chapter ended up being looking back to the 19th century because I wanted the young people in the street to know that they had a legacy and a history. Right? And then the death chapter was like, wow, you know, here it is, right? And that ended up being more contemporary. Yeah.
I'm gonna ask you to read a little bit from the book before we allow the audience to ask some questions.
All right. Thank you. I brought the book up here, but I hadn't thought about that. Let's see, I will actually read from the end of the book. Okay. Even in the midst of crisis, the flowers bloom. Especially in moments of crisis, their blooming is a reminder of something that transcends the moment, a reminder of a deep, deep sense of time, reaching back and stretching forward. In the spring of 2020, when the pandemic hit and New York emerged as an early hotspot, Mom and I decided that it best that she stay in her Philadelphia townhouse. At 92, she is healthy and independent. Her petite stature belies her physical strength. We are blessed with a beautiful network made up of family and a multiracial group of friends. Mia, Laura, and Laura's daughter Madison drop off delicious meals and fresh produce and visit Mom from a safe distance on the sidewalk. Neighbors Judy and Lorene check in frequently and offer to make grocery runs. Mom's great-granddaughter Karen, named for her mother, one of my mother's deceased granddaughters, sends care packages and calls frequently. Irvin, my cousin, regularly parks across the street, sits in his car or pickup, and keeps an eye on the house. I visit from New York every 2 weeks. At first, Mom kept busy sewing masks, but when threading the needles becomes a challenge, my friend Barbara, who is like a second daughter to her, and I encourage her to spend more time in her garden. The yellow roses are first to bloom, and Barbara and I discovered 2 sources for them: the rescued bush that had been given to me by my Aunt Eartha, and a vine which Barbara had given to Mom. It now climbs deep in the crepe myrtle tree. The hydrangeas have been especially abundant and glorious in shades of blue, purple, and magenta. Barbara buys a rake and cleans the teeny yard. She buys a trellis around which she wraps the rose vine. I buy a 4-tiered planter in which we grow petunias, geraniums, and on the bottom tier, some impatiens, since they don't need a lot of light. Barbara adds a potted lavender plant, and Mom surrounds it with white begonias. The death count continues to grow. We lose a family member and cannot be there to comfort his loved ones. Philadelphia becomes a major site of the uprising for Black Lives Matter. Mom expresses love and gratitude for the protesters, but she is also concerned for their safety. The Frank Rizzo statue comes down. When the news becomes unbearable, she puts on a CD, something pretty, like Roy Hargrove with strings, moment to moment. She goes out to her garden and communes with the spirits of her sisters. Eartha, her middle sister, she recalls, loved a yellow rose.
We will take questions.
Or comments.
Yes, sir.
I'm wondering, forgive me if this is an ignorant question, but do you write nonfiction?
It's not, it's a great question. I always wrote fiction, aspired to write fiction, wrote fiction all through college, and then in graduate school stopped writing fiction. But my reading of fiction and my kind of early experiments with it absolutely shape and inform the way I write nonfiction. It shapes and informs my storytelling. And so some of my books are more storytelling than others. Like the Billie Holiday book, because she's such a great storyteller, is a storytelling book, and this one is a storytelling book. And the others are less so, but yes, you're right to hear an aspiring fiction writer in my nonfiction. Yes.
You know, we got precedent here, someone who retired as a scholar.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Our dear Carla Holloway, exactly. I'm following in her footsteps, so maybe I'll follow those as well. There's one back here.
There's concept of brilliance we understand. I feel like it's so important, like as a life lesson, right?
Right.
But also, like, how do we get our students to think through that frame as well?
Yeah.
And I wonder, and I'm thinking too about the relationships of reading and music and listening, right? And I wonder if there's a way that you might tie that together. And all 3 of you, I mean, all of you are teachers, so that's a question for all of you. But maybe what does it mean for you, pedagogically, to ask students or ask people you're teaching or you're working with to read and to read?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's such a good question. I think one of the first things I try to relay, and when people have asked me about the title, and I think it's important that we do this with our students. I say to them that the understand is not a destination. It's a process. And it's a life's commitment, right? so that it's not like I expect you at the end of the class to come to some understanding. What I hope is that you will come to a commitment to understanding, like to being open to it, to constantly revisiting it. There are books that we're going to read together that I still don't understand, right? But I'm going to try to understand them a little more, or I understand them in different ways at this age than I did at your age, you know? So that it's a process, and it's a commitment to a life of learning is what it is, which means you're never going to get bored, right? You're never going to run out of things to do, and that is something we do together. The other thing that I find, and this is part of the process for me of teaching, is sometimes, you know, there's a chapter in this book on justice. I taught a class called African American Novelists and the Concept of Justice, or the Question of Justice. I had no idea what I was going to find. Right. I didn't start with a theory. Right. I really didn't. I didn't come down and impose a theory. And I said to the students, this is a laboratory, basically. Right. Let's figure out what we can find out about this thing. Like, is there something we can say about it? And you're going to help me figure out what Black writers have had to say about it. You're part of this process. And that was so helpful because, one, they didn't feel like they had to have mastery. And two, they taught me so much. You know, my students were sick of the books that I was choosing. So they were like, okay, Professor Griffin, like, you mean like nobody writes about Black vigilantism? Like, so I had to go back and find some people who did, right? So that would be my answer, that it's not a destination, that it's a process. And therefore, it's not about you're going to have to master a body of material at the end of this course.
And there's some vulnerability.
Vulnerability,
as a professor.
absolutely.
When I teach graduate courses, I almost always teach books I've never read.
Yes, right.
So that we can, as a class, read them together. Together,
right. Exactly. And it's being willing to be vulnerable. You know, that I don't know it all, that I'm learning from these books, and more importantly, I'm learning from you. Right. Yeah.
How do we get people to listen until to understand? I mean, Farah mentioned hearing songs a different kind of way. I've listened to Let's Get It On, the album, probably 1,827 times.
Yes.
Right? But I hear something different every time I hear it, right? Because Marvin's doing different things, right? That you don't necessarily pick up on when you hear it the first time.
I think there is a confusion about the word understanding.
Yeah.
Curiosity is a more sturdy tool to me than mastery and knowledge.
Absolutely.
You can know something and not be wise.
Yep.
So wisdom is that thing you do.
Yes.
It's that bump upside the head.
Yes.
That lets you know,
Right.
better not do that again.
Right.
Or this has brought me pleasure.
Yep.
I want to do it again.
Yep.
So we have to look at what we reward
Yes.
in these classrooms.
Yes.
Do we reward curiosity? Do we reward the thinking, listening mind who's on fire? And the whole idea of listening that's a whole nother day-long seminar about what it really is. It's an active process. It's a process of vulnerability. It's a process of humbling yourself, removing the conversation you have in your own head about what's coming in. It's touch. Listening is being willing to be touched. And it's not just hearing those words. So having students take the words and apply them to their own lives in small ways might be a way to reach more brain cells than you would if they just memorized what the person said in the book.
And you mentioned we're reading and listening. I gotta recognize the visual, because both of your shoe games are tight. And if it's anything that my daddy taught me when he walked this earth, it's like, you gotta compliment women on their shoes.
Yes.
Well, our lovely doctor talked about grace and mercy, and I have to say, whoever invented these had no concept of either. Could you talk about grace, like, and mercy? You went so deeply into those,
Right,
into what
right.
they are and what they are not,
Right.
and
Yeah.
it just, I found it just.
Mercy versus have mercy, right? Or Lord have mercy.
Oh, Lord have mercy.
Right.
Oh, it was beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, so the book opens with mercy and ends with grace. And I knew it was going to end with grace, but I'll come back to that. And the mercy was because I had a question about it, you know? And the question was from Phyllis Wheatley's famous poem, you know, "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land." And I remember thinking, I was like, why does she need mercy? Like, you know, like if mercy is being, you know, basically you deserve a punishment, but you don't get the punishment you deserve, or someone who's in a position of power and authority to punish you chooses not to. And I remember always thinking that the people who need mercy, God's mercy, are the people who enslaved her. Like, they're the ones who should be asking for God's mercy, but they are in the position to grant mercy to her, to not be as cruel as their power allows them to be. And so it became this whole meditation on what is mercy, how do we give it to others, that, you know, who deserves it, right? And it was, I think that chapter ends more with questions than answers. Grace, I knew I was going to end with grace because it's a concept that I love, the idea that you get unmerited reward, you can't do anything to earn it, it's just there. And I've always felt like my life was filled with grace. Like every step of the way, there's grace in my life. And the last chapter that I read from is called On Gardens and Grace, because I always think of flowers as grace, you know, that there's a scientific reason why they look like they look and why they smell like they smell. We know that, the scientists, I love the science. But to me, it's just gratuitous beauty sometimes, you know, just like I did nothing to, I'm walking down the street and I happen to look at that hibiscus. Like, and she's just like, whoa, look at me. You know, that if we look for it, it is everywhere. And to be aware of it and be grateful for it and to be conduits of grace to other people, you know. And each one of those were also things that I struggled with because they were not givens. You know, I wanted to believe that I would always treat people with grace. I wanted to believe that I would always treat people mercifully. But from 2016 to 2020, there were some folks I wasn't trying to extend grace and mercy to.
Nope.
You know, it just was, I wasn't there. You know, talk about, I'm trying to grow. I want to be there. Lord, please, like, relieve me of this other thing that I feel right now. So, you know, again, it was process. But yeah, that's what, you know, those were the two sort of balancing things. One thing that is not there that people have asked me about, there's mercy and there's grace, but I did not write a chapter on forgiveness. You know, it's sort of kind of in there, but, and it's informs the mercy and grace chapter, but I did not write a chapter on forgiveness, so, yeah.
Jarvis?
Jarvis.
So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you thought about genre, right, as well, right, and the beautiful way in which you're blending genres, and how did you, touch on that literary critical, or draw on that literary critical skill set, but then pull away from it and take it back to memoir, just the beautiful kinds of collage.
Well, thank you for that question. I think that I decided in this book to honor my writer self. And I was always a writer before I was an academic. I knew that I aspired to be a writer before I knew what an academic was. I often tamed my writer self, pulled her back, she'd burst through. And this time around, I just decided to let her do what she wanted to do. And I didn't, there's some of my books where I changed voice. I didn't change voice. And I decided to write about literature the way she thought about it and read about it and, pull things together. I think I just decided to be true. I have a friend who said, "You have nothing to prove." Absolutely. And so I thought, what would I write if I had nothing to prove? This is what I would write. And I would be honest about my passion for these things. I would be honest about my love for Black people. I wouldn't talk about them. And so I think that's what happened in this book. And I felt freer to allow something that has always been there, like you said, like not to separate it, not to put it over here, not to, to just say, okay, this is what I'm going to do. And then I think when I was finishing it up, when the pandemic, when we had to pull in, and I think for many of us, that was one of those moments where it was like now or never. What am I waiting for? What's really important to me? And so that's what happened. And in terms of genre, I didn't think about genre. I really didn't. I didn't think, this is memoir, but it's also literary. I just thought, let me just write it the way it's coming to me. Yeah, I'll write, and hopefully it will be received. That's what I thought. I hope that it will be received. Yeah, and I've been very kind of overwhelmed with the way that it's been received by all kinds of readers, across race, genders. I had 100 copies sent to incarcerated readers, and so that's what it was. And it felt like a labor of love.
Something really beautiful there about what it means to write from an authentic place.
Yeah.
And then allowing you to be your authentic.
Right. No, absolutely. I think when I wrote the Billie Holiday book, I was headed in that direction. Because it was my second book. I felt like it was my sophomore book, But I still felt like in the Billie Holiday book, I still felt like I had to I could do a little bit of that, but I had to prove my chops a little bit, And so I had to show that I was talking to a certain set of theorists, or that I was trying to break open a field. And I didn't feel that with this one. So.
Not only did you break open the field with the Billie Holiday book, for those who don't know, there will be a conference in honor of Farah Jasmine Griffin opening up that field at Yale next month.
Yes, thank you. Two of the planners are in this room, Jarvis and Titsy.
Yes.
I'm asking a selfish question because I'm from Philly.
Oh, wow.
What's Philly about the book? Because it's so part of what the story is telling, and it seems like it might be a character in the book. And so, what about Philly do you read?
Yeah, Philly girl, huh? Philly is a character in this book. It is definitely a character. It is the through line. It begins and ends with Philadelphia, and it's a particular Philadelphia. Germantown makes a couple of appearances because my aunt lived in Germantown. I have a Forrest Gump story about that too. But it's a particular Philadelphia that's the character in this book. It's a working class Black Philadelphia that's very, very Black, very a city of migrants, creating a culture, at the forefront of jazz culture, rhythm and blues culture. But then I go back and I show that it's always had a kind of militancy. You know, so in the 19th century when they passed the first fugitive slave laws, it's the Philadelphians, black and white, who are like, not here. Like, you know, you are not going, no, we're not going to have that here. And very kind of there's a lot of showmanship about how they do it. But Jill Scott makes an appearance, you know. Or as I said, talk about shoes, the only time in my life I ever played hooky from school, it was my cousin's fault, not my fault. I'm such a shoe fanatic. I was 14, I went to the shoe department of a department store at 10 o'clock in the morning, the day I played hooky. And Patti LaBelle was in there buying shoes. And I asked her for her autograph, and she's like, okay, baby, but why are you not in school? So that's, you know, that's Philly. It's like it's a big city, but it's a little town. Yeah. It's a very small town. You will run into Patti LaBelle and Bonwit Teller. And my Forrest Gump story, which I tell in the book, is a Germantown story. My aunt had a house in Germantown where we spent Thanksgivings and Christmas and everything. And years later, when I met Jeremiah Wright, Reverend Jeremiah Wright, who's also from Philly, he was telling me that he was born in Germantown. And I said, oh, I spent lots of time in Germantown. And I said, my aunt lived in Germantown. And he said, where? And I said, 68 West Duval. And he said, no, she didn't. And I said, yes, she did. And he said to his sister, was that house where we lived? And she said, 68 West Duval. Wow. Yes, he was born. He was born in that house. And when he told me where he was born, I knew exactly where it was because I used to stand on that little platform and pretend I was Nina Freon and sing, like with a hairbrush. So yes, that's Philly. Philly is definitely a character in the book.
One of our partners for the event this evening is Rohiwa Books. You can get a copy of Farah's book signed by Farah by purchasing one or many books that they've brought within the day.
Great books. I'm looking at all these wonderful books.
If you get a chance, you gotta come to the store if you haven't been there. There are always celebrities there, like Alexis and Omi and Antonia and Danielle. Literally almost any hour of the day, and they do great coffee, and now they're doing beer. So do support this important Black woman-owned business in East Door.
Yes.
And please come buy books and get books signed. And thank you all for coming out.
Thank you. This has been beautiful.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back. Black.